Alrighty, hello there, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to our occasional and wonderful chats. It's always a high pleasure and honor to be with you. And as usual, got to give me just a moment to get things situated, and we're off. All right, well, I was just on. Oh, let me turn my volume down there. I was just on Tucker Carlson's show tonight to discuss my latest reporting and writing on the whole issue of the permanent surveillance regimes being instated at colleges and universities across the country, with these appeals to some sort of permanent crisis condition that we are all allegedly living under. And as is the norm for those appearances, you only get a very limited amount of time to express any thoughts. And so if any of you happen to see that, or you're interested in some follow-up, I thought I would maybe do some elaboration on the stream, because on those TV hits or spots, they're often over before you know it, and everything that you had maybe wanted to say doesn't get said. So what's the status of my travails in trying to ascertain, to the best of my ability, the current state of surveillance regimes and other overly intrusive COVID protocols at colleges and universities? Well, number one, let me just preface by saying, if the only issue at stake here, or if the only pertinent factor here was the living arrangements of students at massively expensive private colleges and universities, some public, but largely private actually is what I've been looking into, then I wouldn't bother with this. It wouldn't be relevant, or not relevant enough to spend a whole lot of time focusing on anyway. Even though, I mean, it should be said that the students who are now in the throes of these surveillance regimes against their will, or even though they object to these surveillance regimes, they came into this circumstance through no fault of their own, so therefore they're not to blame. But that said, it wouldn't draw my attention or provoke my ire if this was just about purely what a student at Columbia University can do to socialize. That wouldn't rise to the level of warranting much scrutiny or reporting. Why it does rise to the level of warrant scrutiny reporting is because the colleges and universities, especially the elite universities, and I've gotten messages and information from people at Columbia, Brown, Stanford, USC, you name it. There are among the most prestigious colleges and universities in the country are at this very moment imposing a whole slew, Georgetown, a whole slew of interventionist measures, interventionary tactics, on the basis of a fallacious premise. That premise is that it's the responsibility of administrators to assure students and faculty and staff of maximum 100% unmitigated safety. And when you allow administrators or others in positions of authority to arrogate such powers to themselves, they're going to cling interminably to those powers, because it's human nature. Why would you want to just relinquish voluntarily powers that have been ceded to you under supposedly emergency circumstances? That power becomes intoxicating. It becomes enlivening. It allows you to do things that you would never dream of having the ability to do before, such as monitoring and micromanaging and opining on the propriety of the private affairs of college students. there might be something creepy there in terms of why so many of these administrators are hell-bent on retaining that power, but we shouldn't speculate too much, shouldn't be rude about it. But I think you would be entitled to come up with some fairly sketchy explanations for why it is that some of these administrators want to nitpick the precise details of the social engagements that students who are adults are engaging in. But all that said, elite colleges and universities are not necessarily instructive on their own terms, or that they wouldn't warrant this attention on their own right if they were not incubators of a mentality and of an entire system of thought, which is soon to become the dominant governing ideology of the rest of the country, which is soon to infiltrate a whole host of new institutions far outside the academy, whether that's the corporate world, the nonprofit sector, activism, circles, and governing bodies. So that's why one must, I think, keep a close eye on the goings on at these colleges and universities, because it's not just about whether Timmy and Jody are able to gallivant around on a Saturday night to their heart's content. Although, I mean, you do have to sympathize with kids who are freshmen in college and have had the experience now of a collegiate life where administrators are prying into their every move and reprimanding them if they go to a party or go to a bar, God forbid. You do have to sympathize with them, even though, I mean, their parents are the ones paying boatloads of money for this elite private education. So maybe that sympathy should be tempered somewhat, but still, I mean, on a human level, you gotta give it some consideration that these students, again, through no fault of their own, are in this bizarre situation that is long past the point of having any rational basis. But again, the attitudes and the tendencies and the proclivities being kind of germinated at these institutions are going, I guarantee you, to emanate outward through all manner of other institutions. And that's why even if you have no attachment to like Columbia University or whatever, that's why you ought to be paying closer attention to this. And it's also why the media ought to be covering this more with a skeptical eye, but they're not. I don't know of anybody else who's really covered this to any meaningful extent. If you do, let me know. And when it is covered, when you look at college newspapers, right? When you look at college student-run publications covering this, what they'll normally cover it from the standpoint of is just doing PR for the administration, where they help, their overlords publicize the latest edict. And so there's really not a whole lot of adversarial coverage at all. It would be great to have something approaching like a database, or at least a running list of what private firms, what nonprofit entities, or whatever else are in contract with colleges and universities to provide these surveillance testing services. Because my preliminary research, and I'm going to be writing a piece on this that's dedicated to this subject very soon, so keep an eye out for that. My preliminary research indicates that there's a whole lot of money on the line here to maintain in perpetuity these incessant surveillance testing regimes, which are, in many cases, are the fundamental folly of these whole regimes. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when you subject students and when you require students to submit to mandatory testing regimes, surveillance testing, I mean, shouldn't that word alone be enough to at least raise some suspicion? Surveillance testing, granted, is a long-standing tactic of epidemiology and public health divisions of municipal governments and such, where they do attempt to surveil genuine outbreaks of new pathogens, right? So it's not an inherently dubious practice necessarily, but now it's become so all-encompassing and lost any tethering to logic that it really is an intrusive form of surveillance. Because what happens? Well, if you sign up for a surveillance testing regimen at these regimes, or actually not sign up, but acquiesce to the mandate that you submit to these surveillance testing regimes at these colleges and universities, that comes with an accompanying requirement that you also give into their contact tracing efforts. Now, why we need to continue, or anyone needs to continue contact tracing an outbreak, so-called, of an endemic disease that millions upon millions of people have contracted, as though it's this new burgeoning, virus that maybe is contained in a specific geographic location, that makes no epidemiological sense. And no, I'm not an expert. I didn't go through the credentialing mill to get a degree in epidemiology, but I've talked to enough epidemiologists who actually have a contrary view on this, and I've applied enough discernment to understand that this kind of surveillance testing tactic no longer has any utility from the standpoint of actually securing public health. It does have a lot of utility if you want to continue to have a basis forevermore to snoop and surveil on the lives of students in your charge. And the administrators who are in charge of overseeing these surveillance regimes should really have a little bit more of background research done on them, because at surveillance college, at Connecticut College, my old stomping ground where I was last week, I recently watched a Zoom meeting that was conducted this past Sunday by the head honcho Dean Arcellus, as well as his kind of, helper deans, about the latest status of Connecticut College from the perspective of COVID. And the idea that these people are going to exert control over your private activity, the idea that these people are going to issue pronouncements over whether it's permissible for you to gather with others. And again, remember, always bear in mind when discussing this issue, or when hearing me discuss this issue, that these student populations are almost entirely vaccinated. They've already submitted to the vaccine requirement imposed on them at these colleges and universities. They've already complied with the whole protocol that was supposed to enable a return to normalcy. And yet here we still have all this endless monitoring and nitpicking and busybody interrogation. So you have these administrators who have backgrounds in stuff. I mean, I don't want to be overly tendentious here. I don't want to just come across as crass. But when I was watching this Zoom meeting, and this is all on my Substack today, mtracy.substack.com, I did an article today on this whole subject. When I was watching this Zoom meeting at Connecticut College on Sunday, that was supposed to meant to address the students. Like, they were supposed to listen into this Zoom meeting and pose questions to the deans at Connecticut College about, what their obligations supposedly were and so forth. And one of the helper deans, advising the head honcho dean and crafting policy, answering questions about the virology of the SARS-CoV-2 virus at Connecticut College, this person is the dean of equity and inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion. I don't know, something like that. I could find the exact title for you if I were so moved, but you get the idea. And this person's academic background, this person's academic expertise is in queer theory. Okay, so why is someone who has spent their career immersed in queer theory and developing an expertise on that subject, why are then they now expected to be deferred to issue pronouncements on the propriety of individual behavior and whether students can gather? And at Connecticut College, the head dean lectured students about how horrible they are if they choose to go to a party, if they choose to go to a bar or a restaurant. Connecticut College, they are still not technically allowed to even attend a party. And, I'm not saying undergraduates at a liberal arts college not being able to attend a party is somehow the worst offense ever inflicted on mankind, but it's just one of the most extreme manifestations of this whole permanent crisis mentality that is still ever present at colleges and universities, which, as we know, are setting the terms of what is to come at other institutions of major public significance. And so, when you see these administrative edicts being issued or emailed out, I'm getting email screenshots of the most just annoying, tedious emails from all over the country. People should really look further into what the actual expertise of these officials supposedly is. It's generally not in epidemiology. I mean, they may reference or they may invoke the guidances that they've gotten from actual epidemiologists or public health experts who themselves ought not to be treated with total credulity either. But these individuals who are actually in charge of the day-to-day implementation, like the practical consequences of these policies, where whether it's the Australia-style lockdown at Connecticut College or Columbia University, where residence halls may only be visited by people who live there, and you can't engage in just normal socialization, which is especially important, I would think, among freshmen. So condolences to them, I suppose. But a lot of these people don't have any expertise in anything except that they have been afforded this ability to pull the levers of power within their COVID task forces over the past year and a half. Otherwise, they'd never have any position of authority at all, at least in terms of dictating your movements and what social activities you can engage in, and at what point you may remove your mask to brush your teeth, and so on. And even some of these very prestigious law schools that I've gotten, and I say prestigious sort of in inverted commas, because a lot of dumb people come out of these elite colleges and universities. But even at these law schools, you have deans issuing these grand pronouncements about how one must not, in a college classroom at the University of Southern California, one must not remove one's mask indoors, even to take a split-second drink of water. That's forbidden. And on top of that, the dean solicits students to go around and snitch on one another for committing infractions as trivially minor and ridiculous as that, meaning taking a sip of water and in so doing removing your mask. That's a violation that this dean at USC is imploring students to go around surveilling and report to him. So, on top of like the more formalized surveillance regime, this incessant, useless, superfluous surveillance testing and the contact tracing, so-called, that comes with that. That's the more kind of formal arm of the surveillance regimen. But there's also the less formal arm of it, which is probably even more insidious in some ways, which is that they've fostered this incredibly pervasive snitch culture. And last week I was focused more on Connecticut College and kind of deciphering the nature of the snitch culture there, which is uniquely pernicious, it would seem. But you have versions of this everywhere. And a lot of this, and also you have to, including at USC and Georgetown, and a lot of this, you do have to also be cognizant, is demanded by a faction of students themselves and faculty who are just so wedded to the notion of maximum COVID safety at all times for forever, that they are the ones agitating and lobbying for more restrictive regulations to be imposed on them. Students have been protesting and complaining that their actions and their social lives and their ability to even do something as simple as drink water is not being constrained enough by the college authorities. So that is a very real element of this. Now, I don't want to get into an oversimplistic caricature of these students because, for the past now almost 2 weeks, I've been hearing from them. I've been hearing from a skeptical segment of them just over and over. So I don't want to overly generalize. But the reason why these college administrators are so kind of bludgeoned into issuing these pronouncements is probably a combination of actual ideological commitment to instituting them, meaning they have a firm political, philosophical, like metaphysical commitment to the necessity of maintaining these overly intrusive measures. And they have an investment in the whole infrastructure that's been built up around COVID surveillance, and not even just like literal physical infrastructure, which obviously exists, but on top of that, this whole like mental infrastructure of always needing to be hyper aware of like the case numbers, even though COVID cases have ceased to have any kind of meaningful value in terms of tracking the genuine severity of the disease, and needing to launch into this frenzied action the minute that there's a supposed outbreak. So that's sort of like this kind of mental paradigm that they're attached to, on top of the physical infrastructure, and it all congeals together. But kind of barking at them from the sidelines is this very vocal contingent of students who don't think they're going far enough, and faculty who don't think they're going far enough. I mean, I've seen many open letters, these melodramatic open letters written by faculty who claim that they're not being adequately catered to because students are being subject to severe enough restrictions. So, I mean, I don't envy these administrators in the position that they're in, but I do reserve the right to critique and in some cases mock their overbearing attitude, and also to mock their just extremely insufferable rhetorical style. I hadn't been as aware of the rhetorical style of college administrators as I have been now for some time, because it's the most kind of tedious and just obnoxious manner of communicating. And one thing that I know is that they very consistently do in order to justify these irrational measures that they're imposing. And again, what are these measures? The prohibition on taking a sip of water at Georgetown and USC, Columbia students not being allowed to host visitors in the rooms is very prudish. It's like this neo-prudish kind of almost Puritanism, and on and on and on. I mean, you could just see examples in the Substack if you'd like, or I've been tweeting many of them. Oh yeah, and at Stanford today, apparently everybody just got a blinkered update that those who are playing basketball just at the gym or whatever, they must remain masked throughout. That is what Stanford declared earlier today to the student body, who again, as usual, are all vaccinated, or at least 99% of them are, per the dictates of the university. So, like I said, I don't envy the position that these administrators are in, but as much as I don't envy them, I also just resent from just like a stylistic and I guess an ethical standpoint as well, this whole nomenclature that they invoke to justify their irrational decisions. They're constantly bringing up the community and how we all must band together to protect our community. And in protecting our community, how we achieve that protection and safety is to hold each other accountable. And so that, in a way, displaces where the responsibility lies for these ridiculous and inane measures. The responsibility for these ridiculous and inane measures lies with those who are imposing them, lies with those who are so kind of boxed into this unsustainable philosophy of, all hands on deck COVID mitigation. They're the ones who should be held accountable. But what they do is they kind of flip the script and say, the real, what we all really need to do is hold each other accountable. So that diffuses the blame and spreads it around. And then what happens is these administrators blame the students themselves for engaging in just trivially normal social activities, such as gathering indoors and not being hyper scrupulous about whether your mask is adequately affixed at all times, 24/7. And I think that they invoke this kind of rhetoric around accountability because it's become sort of a common feature of activist rhetoric amongst the younger generation and probably the older as well. But I remember at the protest last year, holding one another accountable, or you must be accountable, or where's the accountability? That was a very common refrain. So they've kind of appropriated that and inserted it into this kind of lexicon around administrative COVID dictates. And I think that's notable, but it's also extremely annoying to even read, even if you are not actually subject to those dictates, which I am not. And also like this idea that the community must be looked after as though the only people who have claim to protection of communal assets or something are these administrators who should be challenged and should be disagreed with and should be rebutted if they're using fallacious reasoning. But again, they insulate themselves from that kind of scrutiny by invoking this whole nonsensical and vague rhetoric around community and accountability and so on. I mean, it's extremely obnoxious. So I sympathize with anybody who has to read that from the standpoint of actually understanding what rules they're subject to. I'm reading it just because I find it perversely fascinating and want to report on it, and also because I have divined wider implications for the rest of society. So that's really what the state of affairs is on this beat. I actually didn't think that I was going to be spending so much time on this when I first started looking into it around 2 weeks ago, but I've just been so flooded with messages from across the country from people asking me to publicize these ridiculous policies and publicize this kind of regime of irrationality that they are now have to bow before, that I must feel kind of a responsibility to stay on the beat, because again, the acquiescence and tolerance of such irrational measures is the same mentality that the students are going to carry with them as they enter other institutions of public significance down the line. And it's going to be in very short order. And if they're continually willing to accept the whole framework of permanent emergency, then that's not going to be great for civil liberties. And when I say not going to be great, that's an extremely kind of charitable way to put it. It's probably going to be a nightmare. And then you have I keep getting these screenshots from people at universities like University of Michigan and UC Irvine and other places where you're required to install this app on your phone to do like a symptom check every day before you enter the campus, and also to upload your vaccination status. And so you're required to walk around with that all day. And then on command, you must display your vaccination status in order to enter facilities, and whoever else wields power over you, they can demand that you present this at any time. And now I'll often get the retort, well, oh, you're exaggerating this and you're making it sound more inflammatory than it actually is. A lot of this stuff is enforced that rigorously. Well, you're right. A lot of it is not enforced that rigorously, but then what does that tell you about the validity of the rules that are on the books? If nobody expects them to be enforced, what purpose do those rules actually serve? Now, that's an interesting question to delve into. I think they serve a whole wide array of purposes. Number one, to make it seem like the administrators are proactive and that they're, they're monitoring the situation very intently. Another is to Another is to maybe shield the universities from litigation, although I'm not sure what the specifics of that situation are in terms of potential legal liability. And also, I think there's this ideological commitment or political commitment to retain measures related to COVID mitigation for the foreseeable future, because again, they've erected this whole system of thought, this whole apparatus around it, and they can't detach. And some of the, I got a lot of flack back in the day during the earlier phases of COVID from right-wing followers and libertarian followers who were incensed that I would be willing to accept any mitigation protocols whatsoever. So, we can go back and debate what the prudent thing was in March of 2020, but I was not a fanatical anti-COVID mitigation person for the most part. But now that's just over. Now, an endemic disease is being exploited to micromanage people's lives, and also to condition them to accept these massive intrusions into their privacy. And that's protecting privacy is the core of civil liberty in the U.S. anyway, and that's being very rapidly eroded. So, and also I'm getting emails with these threats of expulsion if you don't comply with these surveillance testing mandates, all kinds of other threats and penalties that are being lorded over these students, and by and large they're accepting them, or they're even demanding even more stringent penalties for wrongdoers and misbehaviors amongst them. So what does that tell you about the future of civil liberty and whether people value things like privacy and medical privacy, whether they feel that it's warranted to just on command present your private information in that manner? It suggests that there's a whole lot of people that are willing to accept it, and they're going to be the ones running institutions in very short order. That's the current status. I'm now going to do, if it's possible, I'm going to do an extra segment on Rockfin exclusively. So if you're watching here on YouTube, you will have to check the link in the description box to go to Rockfin and watch the remainder of this video, if it works, which it hasn't before, but I will see if that works now. So if you're only on YouTube, so long, but you can go to Rockfin and watch the rest. And I don't think it's working. Okay, so I will go to the Rockfin administrators and see if I can figure out how to do that. Just a few more notes for everybody for free for now. But please look into subscribing to Rockfin, where there's a whole wide array of good content. Increasingly. What was I going to say? Sorry for the interruption. I was going to say that, particularly this whole app situation, what I hear from people is that they have to just go through the motions to list what their symptoms are in order to enter campus, right? So you're on this app, you're affirming that you don't have any COVID symptoms. I haven't seen any studies that are peer-reviewed or have any validity whatsoever that show that going through these kind of dopey protocols on an app where you check off if you have a cough or if you feel feverish or something, where that actually limits the spread of disease. And also, so why are these institutions forcing everyone to go through the motions? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I talk to just random people, not internet commenters who have their own dispositions and kind of represent a very narrow segment of society sometimes, but just regular kind of folks, where even when I was in the UK recently, I would talk to cab drivers. I know it's a cliche, or I would talk to just random people, and they had this inherent skepticism of COVID policy at this point. where they were just annoyed and flustered by it and not seeing the logic undergirding it any longer. And I think that's justified. And it's all the more justified when you go to the University of Michigan or you go to UC Irvine and you have to fill out one of these symptom checks every day, and it has no meaning or it has no utility for anything except to make the people who created the app feel good that they're being complied with. So what does that tell you about some of the underlying logic of all this? That it's just lost the plot. It's just cruising along on autopilot and making everybody submit to these irrational interventions. One thing I keep emphasizing is that unless and until, and this was at the very top of my Substack post today, unless and until institutions recalibrate and understand that a COVID case, meaning a positive test case, is not intrinsically alarming, is not intrinsically cause to proclaim some horrible outbreak, unless they're willing to acknowledge that that metric is no longer salient to determine much of anything, then they're going to continue lurching from, confected crisis to confected crisis. No more should a relatively modest level of viral transmission among young vaccinated adults, no more should that even be labeled an outbreak, as though it was this horrible and alarming event. It should be reframed and recalibrated as something that it's just going to be inevitable. And thankfully, the actual risk from COVID among that demographic is astronomically low. And that also goes for school-age children who are still, in many instances, being forced into quarantine. And, even quarantine, so-called, is not really complied with much of the time for younger children. It's just, again, going through the motions. And if all this now, if so much of this now adds up to just going through the motions, then there's something fundamentally amiss with the whole kind of outlook on this issue right now. I mean, I maintain that those in positions of authority, whether it's over schools, whether it's over other institutions, those in positions of authority who insist on framing COVID as a permanent crisis, refuse to relinquish the powers that they've invested with over the past year and a half, refuse to just kind of modulate their approach at all, and still react in this nonsensical way to just a few quote unquote cases, most of which probably never would have been detected in the first place if not for the overly intrusive surveillance testing regime that you've imposed. Unless those people are willing to change course, then they should be treated with contempt. And I'm not saying that they should be aggressively or violently confronted or anything, or that you should, behave irresponsibly in challenging their logic, but their logic should be challenged in a civilized way. Otherwise, what's going to result is just this mindless acquiescence to a permanent crisis regime. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to live under a permanent crisis regime. I know what the consequences of that are from 9/11, having lived through that. And this is not 9/11. It's not a perfectly analogous situation, but there are similarities in the whole mindset where everything is like this existential threat, or in other words, relatively small threats, small manageable threats, are blown up into some kind of existential menace. And in so doing, a whole rash of wholly unnecessary measures are imposed, and the victim along the way is your privacy and your right to not be constantly surveilled. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll leave it at there for now, and we'll do it again very soon. So take care.